That Tuesday morning, I was out behind my property with my chainsaw, carefully selecting which dying pine trees needed to come down. When I heard the screech of expensive heels on gravel behind me, I turned to see Margaret Whitfield, our HOA president, marching toward me with that familiar look of manufactured outrage plastered D across her face. She was clutching a clipboard like it was some kind of weapon, her perfectly manicured finger already pointing accusingly at my equipment. "Rosa Martinez, you stop that this instant. Those trees belong to the community, and you're destroying our property values." What she didn't know was that I had just discovered something in my grandmother's old paperwork that would turn her little power trip into the most expensive mistake of her HOA career, as she stood there demanding I put down my saw and threatening legal action. I couldn't help but smile, knowing that in a few hours, she'd be the one begging me to stop. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any more epic Karen stories, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The whole mess started 3 weeks earlier when I inherited my grandmother's house on Maple Ridge Drive. Abuela Rosa had lived there since 1974. And honestly, I'd always thought it was just a modest 2-bedroom home on a quarter-acre lot. The house needed work, sure, but the location was perfect. Nestled against a hillside covered in towering pine trees that created this beautiful natural backdrop. What I didn't realize was that those trees, and a lot more besides, were about to become the center of a battle that would reshape the entire neighborhood. I'd been living there for about 2 weeks, slowly sorting through decades of my grandmother's belongings, when I noticed that several of the larger pines directly behind the house were showing signs of disease, brown needles, dead branches, and that telltale lean that suggested they might come down in the next big storm. Growing crow up. My father had worked in forestry, so I knew enough to recognize when trees posed a danger to structures. These particular pines were massive, probably 60 to 80 feet tall, and if they fell toward the house during a windstorm, they'd crush the entire back section. That's when I decided to be proactive and start removing the most dangerous ones myself. I borrowed my neighbor's chainsaw and spent the weekend watching YouTube videos on proper tree removal techniques. My plan was simple. Take down 3 or 4 of the worst trees, cut them into manageable pieces, and either use the wood for my fireplace or sell it to someone who could use it for lumber. The Maple Ridge Homeowners Association had always been known for being a bit overzealous about property maintenance. But I figured removing dangerous trees would be exactly the kind of responsible homeownership they'd appreciate. Boy, was I wrong about that. That Tuesday morning, I'd been working for maybe 20 minutes when Margaret appeared. She was wearing a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. And her silver hair was styled in that aggressive bob that seemed designed to intimidate. Margaret had been the HOA president for nearly a decade, and she ruled the neighborhood with the kind of iron fist that would make dictators jealous. "Rosa Martinez," she announced, as if I might not know my own name, "you are in direct violation of Section 4.3 of the Maple Ridge Community Guidelines regarding alterations to community landscaping features." I turned off the chainsaw and pulled off my safety goggles. "I'm sorry, what?" "These trees are on my property, Margaret. I'm removing them because they're diseased and pose a danger to my house." Her laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Your property? Honey, those trees are clearly visible from the community hiking trail, which makes them part of our shared aesthetic landscape. You can't just go around destroying community resources because you feel like playing lumberjack." I looked back at the trees I'd been working on. Sure, you could probably see them from the hiking trail that ran along the ridge behind my house. But that trail was at least 50 yards away and 20 feet higher in elevation. The idea that trees on my own property somehow belonged to the community because they were visible from a distance seemed absolutely ridiculous. "Margaret, I understand your concern about the neighborhood's appearance, but these trees are dying. If I don't remove them, they're going to fall on their own, probably during the next big storm. I'm being responsible here." She flipped through the papers on her clipboard with dramatic flair. Responsible would have been submitting a formal request to the Architectural Review Committee for approval before taking any action. Responsible would have been hiring a certified arborist to assess the trees professionally. What you're doing is unauthorized destruction of community assets." The way she said community assets made my blood pressure spike. "They're my trees, Margaret. On my land. That I inherited from my grandmother, who planted half of them herself." "Well, according to our records," she said, consulting her clipboard again, "the entire hillside behind Maple Ridge Drive is designated as protected community space in our original development agreements. These trees contribute to the natural beauty that maintains our property values. Your grandmother may have lived here for decades, but that doesn't give you the right to clear-cut our community forest." I felt my temper starting to rise, but I forced myself to stay calm. Margaret had a talent for pushing people's buttons, and I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. "Okay, let me make sure I understand this correctly. You're telling me that trees growing on property I own, that were planted by my family, somehow belong to the HOA because people walking on a trail 50 yards away can see them?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," she said with smug satisfaction. "And if you don't stop this unauthorized tree removal immediately, the HOA will be forced to pursue legal action to protect our community interests." I set down my chainsaw and pulled off my work gloves. "Fine. I'll tell you what, Margaret. Why don't you give me until the end of the week to look into this? I'll check my property documents and see exactly what the boundaries are. If there's some kind of easement or restriction I'm not aware of, we can discuss it like adults." She sniffed disdainfully. "I suppose that's acceptable, as long as you agree to cease all tree removal activities until this matter is resolved. The community has invested too much in maintaining our natural aesthetic to let one person destroy it for their convenience." After she left, I stood there for a long time just staring at the trees I'd been working on. The whole interaction felt surreal. In what world did an HOA get to claim ownership of trees growing on someone else's private property? I'd heard stories about overzealous homeowners associations, but this seemed to cross every reasonable line. That evening, I started digging through the boxes of documents my grandmother had left behind. Most of it was typical household paperwork, utility bills, insurance documents, tax records, but in the bottom of an old filing cabinet, I found a manila envelope labeled "Property Documents, Original Purchase." Inside were papers I'd never seen before, including the original deed from when my grandmother bought the house in 1974. The deed was fascinating reading. Much more detailed than the simple property description I'd expected. It turned out that when my grandmother bought the house, she hadn't just purchased the quarter-acre lot where the house sat. She'd actually bought a much larger parcel that included most of the hillside behind the house. Nearly 3 acres in total. But more interesting was a separate document tucked behind the deed, something called a timber rights agreement. According to this document, when the land was originally developed in the 1970s, the developer had sold the residential lots while retaining timber rights to the forested areas, but for some reason, when my grandmother bought her property, those timber rights had been included in her purchase. Document was very specific. It granted the property owner exclusive rights to harvest, manage, and profit from all timber resources on not just her own expanded lot, but on the entire hillside area behind Maple Ridge Drive. I read through the document 3 times, hardly believing what I was seeing. If this was legitimate, it meant that not only did I own the land where those trees were growing, but I also had exclusive rights to cut down trees throughout the entire area that Margaret was claiming belonged to the community. The next morning, I called the law office that had handled my grandmother's estate. Janet Morrison had been my grandmother's attorney for over 20 years, and she was familiar with all the property details. When I described my situation with the HOA, she asked me to bring in all the documents I'd found. "Rosa, this is very interesting," Janet said after reviewing everything. "Your grandmother was always very meticulous about her paperwork, and these documents appear to be completely legitimate. The timber rights agreement is particularly significant. It essentially gives you authority over tree management for the entire hillside, regardless of who owns the individual residential lots." "So Margaret is completely wrong about the HOA having any claim to those trees?" "More than wrong," Janet replied. According to these documents, if anyone has been using that hillside area for a community trail without permission, they've technically been trespassing on your property. The timber rights also give you the authority to restrict access if you choose to do so. I felt a smile spreading across my face. So if I wanted to, I could legally block their precious hiking trail? You could, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, I'd recommend having a surveyor confirm the exact property boundaries described in these documents. If everything checks out the way it appears to, then yes, you have significantly more rights here than the HOA realizes. That afternoon, I called Henderson Surveying, the company that had done boundary work for several neighbors over the years. Tom Henderson was able to come out the next day to do a preliminary survey based on GRAT, the legal descriptions in my documents. The results were even better than I'd hoped. Not only did my property extend much further up the hillside than I'd realized, but the community hiking trail that Margaret was so concerned about actually crossed my land for nearly 200 yards. The trail had been there so long that everyone just assumed it was some kind of public easement. But according to my property documents, no such easement had ever been granted. "Ma'am," Tom said, showing me the boundary markers he'd placed. "You own everything from your back fence line up to about 30 feet past where that trail runs. The trail itself, the trees on both sides of it, the little wooden bridges they built over the creek, all of that is on your property." That evening, I sat on my back porch, looking up at the hillside with completely new eyes. What had seemed like a modest inheritance was actually a substantial piece of property. And the trees that Margaret was so desperate to protect were not only mine to cut, but I had legal documentation giving the exclusive timber rights. The more I thought about it, the more irritated I became about Margaret's condescending attitude. She'd stood there threatening legal action, claiming community ownership of my family's property, treating me like some kind of vandal for maintaining my own land. The memory of her smug superiority made my blood boil. Friday morning, I called Margaret to update her on my research. I kept my tone professional and friendly, even though part of me wanted to gloat. "Hi, Margaret, it's Rosa Martinez. I've done that research you suggested about my property boundaries and tree removal rights." "Oh, good," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm sure you've discovered that community aesthetic preservation takes precedence over individual property owner preferences. The HOA is prepared to work with you on a reasonable tree management plan that protects our shared interests." Actually, Margaret, I discovered something quite different. It turns out that not only do I own the land where those trees are growing, but I also hold exclusive timber rights for the entire hillside behind Maple Ridge Drive. According to my legal documents, I have the authority to harvest trees throughout that entire area. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" "I said I own the timber rights for the whole hillside." "The land where your community trail runs?" "That's my property too." "The trees you're so concerned about protecting?" "Those are mine to cut down whenever I choose." Her voice turned icy. "That's impossible. The HOA has maintained that trail for 15 years. The community has invested thousands of dollars in improvements and maintenance." "I'm sure they have, but they've been doing it on my private property without permission. I have the original deed and timber rights agreement from 1974. My attorney has confirmed that everything is legitimate and legally binding." "Well," Margaret sputtered, "even if that's true, there are still community standards to consider. You can't just destroy the natural landscape that everyone enjoys." "We'll fight this, Rosa. The HOA has resources, and we're not going to let one person ruin what we've all worked to build." "That's certainly your choice, Margaret. But I'd recommend that the HOA consult with a property attorney before making any decisions. My lawyer says that anyone using my land without permission has been trespassing, and that includes your community trail." After I hung up, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in years. The woman who'd stood in my backyard threatening legal action was about to discover that she'd picked a fight with the wrong person. Over the weekend, I did more research into timber values and tree removal services. It turned out that mature pine trees, especially the larger specimens growing on my hillside, could be quite valuable. A logging contractor I spoke with estimated that just the trees in the immediate area behind my house could be worth anywhere from $8,000 to $12,000, depending on quality and market conditions. Monday morning, Margaret called me back. Her tone was distinctly less aggressive than it had been on Friday. "Rosa, I'd spoken with the HOA board about your claims regarding property ownership. While we haven't had a chance to verify your documents yet, we're willing to discuss a compromise. Perhaps we could work out some kind of arrangement where you agree to limit tree removal to genuinely dangerous specimens, and the community could even help offset the cost of professional tree service." I almost laughed at the shift in her approach. "That's very generous, Margaret, but I don't think a compromise is necessary. I've decided to proceed with my original plan to remove the diseased trees. I've also contacted a logging contractor about harvesting some of the larger mature trees that have commercial value. Rosa, please be reasonable. Surely we can find a solution that works for everyone. The community trail is very important to property values throughout the neighborhood." "The community trail that crosses my private property without permission?" Another long pause. "Well, that's something we'd need to research further." "I've already done the research, Margaret. My surveyor confirmed that your trail crosses my land for about 200 yards. If the HOA wants to continue using it, you'll need to negotiate an easement agreement with me." "An easement agreement?" "Standard legal arrangement. You pay me for the right to use my property, and we establish specific terms about what kind of use is permitted. My attorney says it's a very common practice when communities want to maintain trails across private land." I could practically hear her grinding her teeth. "And what kind of compensation would you expect for such an agreement?" "Oh, I haven't really thought about it yet." "I suppose it would depend on things like maintenance responsibilities, liability insurance, restrictions on the number of users, that kind of thing. But we can discuss all that after I finish my tree removal project." The truth was, I had no intention of blocking the community trail permanently. My grandmother had enjoyed having people walk through the area, and I appreciated the fact that neighbors took care of maintaining the path. But Margaret's attitude had been so insulting and presumptuous, but I wanted her to sweat a little before we worked out any kind of agreement. Tuesday morning, I resumed my tree removal work. This time, I made sure to start early enough that the sound of my chainsaw would wake up everyone in the neighborhood. If Margaret wanted to play hardball about community standards, I figured the community should be aware of what was happening. Sure enough, by 8 a.m., I had an audience. Several neighbors had come out to see what was going on, and Margaret appeared right on schedule, marching across my backyard with her clipboard and her indignant expression. "Rosa Martinez, I told you to stop this unauthorized destruction of community property." This time, I didn't even turn off my chainsaw. I just smiled and waved. Then went back to cutting through the trunk of a large pine that had been dropping dead branches all over my roof. Margaret stormed closer, close enough that I had to stop working for safety reasons. "I'm warning you, the HOA will not tolerate this destruction of our natural assets." "Margaret," I said, pulling off my safety goggles again, "I've told you multiple times that these are my trees on my property. If you keep harassing me about it, I'm going to have to call the police and report you for trespassing." "Trespassing? This is community land." "No, it's not. It's my private property, and you're standing on it without permission." I gestured toward the small crowd of neighbors who'd gathered. "In fact, all of you are trespassing. I've been patient about it, but my attorney says I have every right to restrict access to my land." One of the neighbors, an older man named Bill Crawford, stepped forward. "Rosa, what's this about private property? That trail has been there since before most of us moved to the neighborhood." "That's true, Bill, but it's still my land. My grandmother owned it, and now I do. The trail is there because my family allowed it, not because the community has any legal right to it." Margaret's face was turning an alarming shade of red. "This is ridiculous. You can't just claim ownership of community space that's been used by everyone for decades." "I'm not claiming ownership, Margaret. I have ownership. Legal, documented, surveyed ownership. And if you don't stop harassing me about cutting trees on my own property, I'm going to start charging admission for people to use my trail." The crowd of neighbors began murmuring among themselves. Several people pulled out their phones, probably to call other neighbors or maybe to record the confrontation. Margaret looked around at the audience, clearly realizing that the situation was spiraling beyond her control. "This isn't over, Rosa," she said, her voice tight with anger. "The HOA will not be bullied by one person's selfish agenda." After she left, several neighbors stayed to ask questions about the property situation. Most of them were reasonable about it once I explained the background, though Crawford was particularly understanding. "Rosa, I had no idea your grandmother owned all that land. We always just assumed the trail was some kind of public access. If it's your property, you've been very generous letting everyone use it all these years." "I don't mind people using the trail, Bill. My grandmother enjoyed having neighbors walk through the area. My issue is with Margaret treating me like a criminal for maintaining my own trees." That afternoon, I got a call from Janet Morrison. "Rosa, I just received a very interesting phone call from the HOA's attorney. Apparently, they want to schedule a meeting to discuss your property claims." "Their attorney called you?" "Stuart Blackwood from Blackwood & Associates. He represents the Maple Ridge HOA. He seems surprised to learn that your property documents are legitimate. Apparently, the HOA has been operating under the assumption that they had some kind of community ownership of the Hillside area." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that your property ownership and timber rights are clearly documented and legally sound. I also mentioned that the HOA has been using your land without permission for quite some time. He asked if you'd be willing to meet with them to discuss the situation." "Are you recommending that I meet with them?" "I think it might be worthwhile, as long as we control the terms. They're clearly in a weak legal position, and they probably realize that. If they want to work out some kind of arrangement, it would be better to do it through negotiation than litigation." We scheduled a meeting for the following Thursday at Janet's office. I spent the rest of the week continuing my tree removal work. Partly because the trees genuinely needed to come down, but mostly because I enjoyed the fact that the sound of my chainsaw was driving Margaret absolutely crazy. Thursday afternoon, I arrived at Janet's office to find Margaret, two other HOA board members, and their attorney waiting in the conference room. Stuart Blackwood was a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, the kind of lawyer who probably charged $500 an hour and wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Ms. Martinez," he said, rising to shake my hand, "thank you for agreeing to meet with us. I've reviewed your property documents, and I have to say, they're quite comprehensive." Margaret was sitting rigidly in her chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked like she'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Mr. Blackwood," I replied, "I appreciate the HOA's willingness to discuss this situation rationally. I'm hoping we can work out an arrangement that's fair to everyone." "Yes, well, that's certainly our goal. The HOA has invested considerable time and resources in maintaining the trail system behind Maple Ridge Drive. We had assumed, incorrectly it seems, that the area was designated as community space in the original development agreements." Janet spread out copies of my property documents on the conference table. "As you can see, Mr. Blackwood, Ms. Martinez has clear title to the land in question, as well as exclusive timber rights for the entire hillside. The trail system you mentioned has been operating on her private property without any formal easement agreement." One of the other board members, a woman named Susan Pierce, spoke up. "Surely there must be some kind of grandfather clause or adverse possession claim. The community has been using that area for over 15 years. "Adverse possession requires that the use be hostile to the property owner's interests," Janet replied. "In this case, the use appears to have been permissive. Ms. Martinez's grandmother allowed neighbors to use the trail, but that doesn't establish any legal right to continued access." Stuart Blackwood nodded slowly. "That's consistent with our legal research. Ms. Martinez, the HOA would like to propose a solution that recognizes your property rights while preserving community access to the trail system." "I'm listening," I said. "We'd like to negotiate a formal easement agreement that would give the HOA permanent rights to maintain and use the existing trail in exchange for appropriate compensation and a formal recognition of your timber rights." Margaret finally spoke up, her voice tight with controlled anger. The board is willing to offer you $5,000 for a permanent easement, plus an agreement that you'll consult with the HOA before removing any trees visible from the trail. I almost laughed at the offer. $5,000 for permanent rights to 200 yards of prime trail access, plus restrictions on my timber rights? They were either completely delusional or seriously underestimating my position. That's an interesting starting point, I said diplomatically, but I think there are some fundamental issues with that proposal. Such as? Stewart asked. Well, first, $5,000 seems low for a permanent easement across that much property. Second, I'm not willing to give up my timber rights or accept any restrictions on tree removal. These trees are a valuable resource, and I intend to manage them as I see fit. Margaret's face was turning red again. Those trees are part of the natural landscape that makes this neighborhood desirable. You can't just clear-cut the entire hillside for profit. I don't plan to clear-cut anything, Margaret. But I also don't plan to let the HOA dictate what I can and can't do with my own property. Janet leaned forward. Perhaps we should discuss what kind of arrangement might be acceptable to Ms. Martinez. I'd been thinking about this all week, and I had a pretty clear idea of what I wanted. I'm willing to grant a trail easement, but it would need to be a license agreement, not a permanent easement. Something that can be reviewed and renewed periodically. I'd also want $25,000 up front, plus an annual fee of $2,000 for maintenance and liability costs. The silence in the room was deafening. Margaret looked like she was about to have a stroke. $25,000? Susan Pierce gasped. That's completely unreasonable. Actually, Janet said calmly, it's quite reasonable for an easement of this type and duration. Trail easements in this area typically run between $10 and $15 per linear foot. Ms. Martinez is asking for roughly $12 per foot, which is well within market range. Stuart Blackwood was taking notes. And the annual fee? $2,000 annually covers insurance, liability, and maintenance costs. Ms. Martinez would retain the right to revoke the license if the terms aren't met, or if the trail use becomes incompatible with her property rights. Margaret finally exploded. This is extortion. You're trying to profit from community resources that don't belong to you. I looked at her calmly. Margaret, these resources do belong to me. I have the legal documents to prove it. The fact that you've been using my property without permission for 15 years doesn't give you any right to continue doing so. The HOA will fight this, she said. We'll sue you to establish community access rights. Janet smiled. That's certainly your prerogative, Ms. Whitfield, but I should warn you that such a lawsuit would likely result in significant legal costs for the HOA, with very little chance of success. Ms. Martinez's property rights are clearly established. Stewart cleared his throat. I think we need to discuss this proposal with the full board before making any decisions. Ms. Martinez, would you be willing to hold off on any further tree removal while we consider your terms? I'm willing to limit my tree removal to genuinely dangerous specimens while you deliberate, but I won't agree to stop entirely. And I should mention that I've received an offer from a logging contractor to harvest some of the mature timber. If we can't reach an agreement soon, I may need to proceed with that project. Margaret's eyes widened. You wouldn't dare clear-cut that hillside. I wouldn't clear-cut anything, but selective logging of mature trees is well within my rights. The contractor estimates there's probably $8,000 to $12,000 worth of marketable timber just in the area immediately behind my house. The meeting broke up shortly after that, with the HOA agreeing to consider my proposal and get back to us within a week. As we were leaving, Stuart Blackwood pulled me aside. Ms. Martinez, I hope you'll be patient with the board. This situation has caught them completely off guard, and some of the members are having trouble accepting the legal realities. I understand their position, Mr. Blackwood, but I also hope they understand mine. I've been more than reasonable about this whole situation. Over the weekend, I continued my tree removal work, focusing on the trees that posed the most immediate danger to my house. The sounds of my chainsaw echoed across the neighborhood, and I noticed that several neighbors had started taking different routes for their daily walks. Monday morning, I got a call from the logging contractor I'd spoken with earlier. Ms. Martinez, I've had a chance to walk your property and assess the timber situation. I think my original estimate was actually conservative. There's probably closer to $15,000 worth of marketable timber on that hillside. 15,000? That's more than I expected. Yes, ma'am. You've got some beautiful mature pines up there, and the market for construction lumber is very strong right now. If you decide to move forward, I could have a crew out there next week. That afternoon, Margaret called me. Her tone was distinctly different from our previous conversations, less aggressive and more diplomatic. Rosa, the HOA board met over the weekend to discuss your proposal. We're prepared to make a counteroffer. I'm listening. $15,000 for a 10-year license agreement with an annual fee of $1,000. You would retain your timber rights, but agree to provide 30 days' notice before any major tree removal projects. It wasn't what I'd asked for, but it was much closer to reasonable. The 30-day notice requirement was a bit annoying, but not a deal-breaker. That's closer to what I had in mind. I said, but I'd need the annual fee to be $1,500, and the notice period would be 2 weeks, not 30 days. I'll have to discuss that with the board. Of course. But Margaret, I should let you know that I've been in touch with a logging contractor, and he's ready to start harvesting timber next week if I give him the go-ahead. The value of the timber on that hillside is apparently quite substantial. There was a pause. How substantial? Around $15,000 according to his assessment? That's just for selective harvesting of mature trees, not clear-cutting or anything dramatic. $15,000? That's right. So you can see why I'm motivated to move forward with some kind of arrangement quickly. Tuesday morning, Margaret called back with the board's acceptance of my revised terms. $15,000 up front. $1,500 annually, 10-year license agreement, 2 weeks' notice for major tree removal. I agreed to have Janet draft the paperwork. But on Wednesday, things took an unexpected turn. Margaret called ITNS. Again? This time, with a completely different tone. Rosa, I've been thinking about this situation, and I've decided that the HOA shouldn't have to pay you anything for access to what has always been community space. We're prepared to go to court to establish our rights. I was genuinely surprised by the reversal. Margaret, I thought we had an agreement. We had a proposal, but the more I think about it, the more convinced I am that you're trying to profit from community resources. The HOA will not be blackmailed. It's not blackmail, Margaret. It's a property easement agreement, which is a standard legal arrangement. We'll see what a judge has to say about that. After I hung up, I called Janet to update her on this latest development. She sighed when I explained what had happened. Well, if they want to fight it in court, that's their choice. But they're going to spend a lot more money on legal fees than they would on your easement agreement. How long would a court case take? Probably 6 months to a year, maybe longer if they appeal. In the meantime, you're free to manage your property as you see fit. That's when I decided to call the logging contractor back. This is Rosa Martinez. I think I'm ready to move forward with that timber harvesting project we discussed. Excellent. When would you like us to start? How soon can you begin? I could have a crew out there Monday morning if you want. Perfect. Let's do it. Friday afternoon, I posted notices on all the neighborhood message boards and community websites, informing residents that logging operations would begin the following Monday on private property behind Maple Ridge Drive. I mentioned that the community trail would be temporarily closed for safety reasons, and that residents should find alternative routes for their daily walks. The response was immediate and dramatic. My phone started ringing within an hour of posting the notices, with neighbors asking questions, expressing concerns, and, in some cases, demanding that I stop the logging operation. Margaret called me twice Friday evening, once to threaten legal action and once to beg me to reconsider. Rosa, please be reasonable. You're going to destroy 15 years of community investment in that trail system. Margaret, I gave you multiple opportunities to work out a reasonable agreement. You chose to take a hostile approach, so now I'm exercising my property rights. But $15,000 worth of trees? That's going to devastate the landscape. It's selective harvesting, not clear-cutting. The contractor will remove maybe 20 or 30 mature trees from a hillside that has several hundred trees total. The impact will be minimal. Can't we go back to negotiating? The board might be willing to reconsider your original proposal. The time for negotiation was last week, Margaret. You had a deal, and you chose to walk away from it. Monday morning, the logging crew arrived right on schedule. I'd hired Henderson Surveying to mark the exact boundaries of my property, so there would be no question about which trees could be harvested. The crew chief, an experienced logger named Mike Santos, walked the site with me to identify the specific trees we'd be removing. "Ma'am, this is some beautiful timber up here. That big pine by the trail? That's probably worth $800 by itself." The tree he was pointing to was one of the largest on the hillside, a massive pine that had to be at least 100 years old. It was growing right next to the community trail, and removing it would definitely change the character of the area. "Are you sure it needs to come down?" "Well, it's not diseased or anything, but it's exactly the kind of mature timber that brings top dollar. Plus, taking it down will open up the canopy and let some light reach the smaller trees underneath." By noon, the crew had removed 6 large trees, including the massive pine by the trail. The sound of chainsaws and heavy equipment echoed across the neighborhood, and I noticed that several neighbors had gathered at the edge of my property to watch the operation. Margaret appeared around 1 o'clock, looking absolutely distraught. "Rosa, you have to stop this. You're destroying the most beautiful part of our neighborhood." "I'm harvesting timber from my own property, Margaret. Timber that you refused to let me manage according to our negotiated agreement. Please, can't we work something out? The board is willing to meet your original terms." My original terms were $15,000 up front, plus $1,500 annually. But that was before you decided to threaten me with a lawsuit. What would it take to stop this logging operation? I looked around at the work site, where the crew was preparing to take down another large pine. $25,000 up front, plus $2,000 annually, for a 5-year agreement, and I retain complete timber rights with no notice requirements. $25,000? That's impossible. That's my offer, Margaret. Take it or leave it. She stood there for a moment, watching as another century-old tree crashed to the ground. I need to call the board. The logging operation continued through Tuesday and Wednesday. By Wednesday evening, the crew had removed 18 mature trees and generated approximately $11,000 in revenue. The check from the lumber company was more money than I'd seen in one place since my grandmother's life insurance payout. Wednesday night, Margaret called me again. "Rosa, the board has agreed to your terms. $25,000 up front, $2,000 annually, 5-year agreement." "I'm sorry, Margaret, but that offer expired yesterday. The new terms are $30,000 up front, plus $2,500 annually." $30,000? You can't keep raising the price every time we talk. Actually, I can. It's my property, and every day you wait, I harvest more timber and become less interested in preserving your trail access. Thursday morning, the logging crew began working on the trees closest to the trail itself. These were some of the most visible specimens, and removing them would fundamentally change the hiking experience. Mike Santos had warned me that taking down these particular trees would probably eliminate the trail's appeal for most users. "Once we remove this section, ma'am, there won't be much point in having a trail through here. It'll just be open hillside with stumps and logging roads." That's exactly what I was counting on. Thursday afternoon, my phone rang constantly. Neighbors, board members, even people from other parts of town who'd heard about the logging operation. Everyone wanted me to stop, to negotiate, to preserve the community trail that had become such an important part of the neighborhood's identity. At 5 o'clock, Margaret showed up at my house with Stuart Blackwood and what looked like a cashier's check. "Rosa, we accept your terms," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. $30,000 up front, $2,500 annually, 5-year agreement. Stuart Blackwood stepped forward with the paperwork. "Ms. Martinez, the board has authorized this payment to stop the logging operation immediately. We're prepared to sign the agreement today." I looked at the cashier's check in Margaret's trembling hands. $30,000. More money than my grandmother had probably seen in her entire lifetime of careful budgeting and modest living. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who'd stood in my backyard a week ago threatening to sue me was now literally paying me to stop exercising my property rights. "I appreciate the offer," I said slowly, "but I'm afraid I'm no longer interested in preserving trail access." Margaret's face went white. "What do you mean?" "I mean, the trail is gone, Margaret. Look around. Half the trees that made it scenic and appealing are already harvested. The logging roads have torn up the path itself. Even if I stop the operation right now, there's no trail left to preserve." Stewart cleared his throat. "Ms. Martinez, surely we can work out some kind of restoration plan. The HOA would be willing to pay for replanting, trail reconstruction, whatever it takes." I shook my head. "The logging operation has been quite profitable, Mr. Blackwood. I've made over $11,000 in 3 days. And the crew estimates they can harvest another $10,000 worth of timber before they're finished. Why would I give up that revenue to restore access for people who treated me like a criminal?" Margaret sank down onto my front porch steps, looking utterly defeated. "Rosa, please. This trail has been part of our community for 15 years. Families have been hiking there together. Children have learned to love nature on that path. You're destroying something that can't be replaced." For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the way she'd marched into my backyard with her clipboard and her threats, treating me like some kind of trespasser on my own property. "Margaret, you had multiple opportunities to work with me on this. I offered you reasonable terms for a trail easement. You chose to get aggressive and threaten lawsuits instead. Now you're dealing with the consequences of that decision." "But $30,000, plus the annual fees? That's more than we pay for snow removal for the entire neighborhood." "That's not my problem. You should have thought about the cost before you decided to pick a fight with the person who actually owns the land." Thursday evening, I sat on my back porch with a glass of wine, looking up at the hillside where the logging crew had been working. The landscape was definitely changed, no question about that. Where there had once been a dense canopy of mature pines, there were now clear patches of sky and stumps marking where the largest trees had stood. But it wasn't the devastation that Margaret had predicted. Most of the smaller trees were still standing, and in a few years they'd grow to fill in the gaps left by the harvested timber. The trail itself was indeed destroyed, not just by the tree removal, but by the heavy equipment that had been necessary to extract the logs. What had once been a narrow, winding path through the forest was now a network of wider access roads designed for logging trucks. The intimate, natural character that had made the trail special was gone. But as I sat there watching the sunset through the newly opened canopy, I realized I didn't feel guilty about it. The trail had been a nice amenity, sure, but it had existed entirely at my family's generosity. The community had gotten 15 years of free access to my property, 15 years of hiking and nature walks without paying a dime in compensation or even acknowledging who actually owned the land they were walking off on. Margaret's attitude had crystallized something that had been bothering me since I'd inherited the property. The entitlement. The assumption that my family's land was somehow community property just because people had been using it. The immediate jump to threats and legal action when I tried to exercise basic property maintenance rights. Friday morning, Mike Santos knocked on my door with the final paperwork from the logging operation. "Ma'am, we're all finished up there. Final tally is $19,400 for the timber we harvested." I stared at the check. Combined with the $11,000 from earlier in the week, the logging operation had generated over $30,000 in revenue. More than the HOA had been willing to pay to preserve the trail, and I still owned all the land and retained all my timber rights. "Mike, what would it cost to install a gate across the old trail access point?" He scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Depends what kind of gate you want. Basic metal gate with a lock, maybe $800 installed. Something fancier, like wrought iron with stone pillars, could run $3,000 or $4,000. Let's go with something substantial. I want to clear that the area is private property." "Yes, ma'am. I can have my crew install something nice for you next week." That afternoon, I drove into town to deposit the timber checks and think about what I wanted to do with my unexpected windfall. $30,000 was more money than I'd ever had in my savings account at one time. It opened up possibilities I'd never considered before. I could use the money to renovate my grandmother's house, bringing the kitchen and bathrooms into the 21st century. I could invest it for my retirement, since my job at the county planning office wasn't exactly going to make me wealthy. Or I could use it as a down payment on investment property, maybe a rental house that would generate ongoing income. But as I was driving home, I passed the entrance to Maple Ridge Drive and saw Margaret standing by her mailbox, talking animatedly with Susan Pierce and Bill Crawford. When she saw my truck, her expression darkened, and she actually stepped into the street as if she was going to try to flag me down. I slowed down and rolled down my window. "Is there something I can help you with, Margaret?" "Rosa, the board has been talking, and we're prepared to make one final offer. $50,000 for a permanent easement that would allow us to rebuild the trail." $50,000. It was a substantial amount of money, more than I'd ever imagined the trail access could be worth. But it was also an admission of just how valuable that land really was, and how badly the HOA wanted to maintain their community amenity. "Margaret, even if I was interested in selling an easement, which I'm not, $50,000 wouldn't cover the restoration costs. The logging operation has changed the entire character of that hillside. You'd be looking at years of replanting and trail reconstruction. We're willing to handle all the restoration costs separately. $50,000 just for the easement rights." I could see the desperation in her eyes. The trail had clearly been more important to the community than I'd realized, and its loss was hitting harder than anyone had expected. "I'll tell you what, Margaret. I'm not interested in selling an easement, but I am willing to consider a different kind of arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" "The HOA can purchase the entire hillside property from me for $200,000. That would give you complete control over the land, and you could rebuild the trail however you want." Margaret's eyes widened. $200,000? That's ridiculous. Actually, it's quite reasonable for 3 acres of prime hillside property in this area. You'd be getting the land, the timber rights, and complete control over future development. The HOA doesn't have that kind of money. Then I guess you'll have to live without your trail. That evening, I called Janet Morrison to update her on the latest developments. "Rosa, I have to say, you've handled this entire situation brilliantly. You've turned what started as harassment into a significant financial opportunity." "I never intended for it to go this far, Janet. I just wanted to remove some dangerous trees from my property." Sometimes the best business opportunities come from standing up for your rights when other people try to push you around. You've established clear property boundaries, generated substantial revenue, and sent a message that you won't be intimidated. Over the weekend, I used some of the timber money to hire a landscaping contractor to clean up the logging debris and reseed the areas where heavy equipment had disturbed the soil. I also had Mike Santos install a beautiful wrought iron gate with stone pillars at the point where the old trail had connected to the neighborhood street. The gate was topped with a discreet but clear private property sign. The transformation was dramatic. What had once been an open, inviting trail entrance was now clearly marked as private land. The gate wasn't hostile or unwelcoming, but it definitely established boundaries in a way that the old trail never had. Monday morning, I was working in my garden when I heard voices at the new gate. I looked up to see a group of neighbors, including Margaret, standing at the entrance and looking up at the hillside. "It's like a completely different place," I heard Susan Pierce say. "I can't believe how much those trees changed the whole feel of the area." Bill Crawford was shaking his head. 15 years we've been hiking up there. My kids learned to ride bikes on that trail." Margaret noticed me watching from my garden and walked over to my property line. "Rosa, some of the neighbors are organizing a petition to ask the county to designate this area as a public preserve. They might be able to use eminent domain to force you to sell." I stood up and brushed the dirt off my hands. "Margaret, I've researched eminent domain laws pretty thoroughly. The government can only take private property for genuine public use, and only after proving that there's no other way to achieve the public benefit. There are dozens of other trail systems in this county. A judge would never approve eminent domain just to restore one neighborhood's hiking trail. But this trail was special. It was part of what made Maple Ridge Drive such a desirable place to live." "That's true. and property values in the neighborhood will probably decline somewhat without it. But that's not my responsibility. The trail existed because my family was generous enough to allow public access to our private property. When the community decided to treat me as an enemy instead of recognizing that generosity, they lost the privilege. Margaret's shoulders sagged. So there's really no way to get the trail back? Not unless the HOA wants to pay $200,000 for the land or individual neighbors want to purchase hiking easements for, say, $10,000 each. $10,000 each? Limited trail access, specific hours, liability insurance required, annual fees, standard easement terms for private recreational land use. She walked away without saying anything else, but I could see her mind working. $10,000 was a lot of money for individual families, but it was probably manageable for some of the more affluent neighbors if they really valued the trail access that much. Over the next few weeks, I had several neighbors approach me individually about purchasing personal easements. Bill Crawford offered $8,000 for a family hiking license. The Hendersons, who lived 3 houses down, offered $12,000 for extended access that would include their teenage children's friends. I turned them all down, not because the money wasn't appealing, but because I'd realized something important about property rights and community relationships. The trail had been valuable to the community precisely because it was free and unrestricted. The moment it became a commercial transaction, it would lose the casual, communal character that had made it special. More importantly, allowing individual easements would essentially recreate the same boundary and management problems that had caused the original conflict with Margaret. I'd end up spending my time mediating disputes between neighbors about who was allowed to use the trail when, dealing with liability issues, and arguing about maintenance responsibilities. A month after the logging operation finished, I used $15,000 of the timber money to have a professional landscape architect design a private garden area where the trail entrance had been. The design included native plantings, a small pond, and walking paths that were clearly contained within my property boundaries. The garden served multiple purposes. It was beautiful and increased my property value. It provided me with a private outdoor space that I could enjoy without worrying about random neighbors walking through. And it sent a clear message that the land was now being used for my benefit, not as a community amenity. The transformation of the hillside also had an unexpected benefit. Without the dense canopy of mature trees, the smaller pines and deciduous trees were getting more sunlight and growing more rapidly. The logging had essentially created a more diverse and sustainable forest ecosystem, even though that hadn't been my primary goal. 6 months after the whole conflict started, I ran into Margaret at the grocery store. She looked tired and older than I remembered, as if the stress of the trail situation had taken a physical toll. "Rosa," she said, her voice much quieter than the aggressive tone I'd become accustomed to, "I owe you an apology." I was genuinely surprised. An apology? I handled that whole situation terribly. I was so focused on protecting what I thought were community rights that I never bothered to verify who actually owned the land. I treated you like a criminal for maintaining your own property. I appreciate you saying that, Margaret. The board has been talking about the mistakes we made, and we've implemented new policies for researching property ownership before making any claims about community assets. We should have done that from the beginning. It was more accountability than I'd expected from her, and I had to admit that I respect in her willingness to acknowledge the HOA's mistakes. "How is the neighborhood adjusting to not having the trail?" I asked. "It's been harder than I expected. Property values have declined about 8% according to our realtor contacts. Several families have mentioned the trail loss as a factor in their decisions to move. We underestimated how important it was to people's quality of life." "I'm sorry to hear that." "No, you're not," she said with a rueful smile. "And you shouldn't be. We had 15 years of free access to your family's land, and we responded to your reasonable property maintenance by threatening lawsuits. The consequences are our own fault." As I drove home from the grocery store, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that Tuesday morning when Margaret first confronted me about cutting down trees. The timber money had given me financial security I'd never had before. The boundary dispute had taught me about the value of standing up for my rights, even when it was uncomfortable. But most importantly, the whole experience had shown me the difference between being generous and being taken advantage of. My grandmother had been generous in allowing neighbors to use her land for hiking. The community had taken advantage of that generosity by treating the access as an entitlement rather than a privilege. A year later, I used more of the timber money to build a small guest cabin on the hillside where the trail used to run. The cabin was designed for rental income, targeting weekend visitors who wanted a quiet retreat in a forested setting. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now charging strangers for the privilege of enjoying the same natural beauty that I'd once allowed neighbors to access for free. The rental cabin has been consistently booked, generating about $1,500 a month in income. The guests appreciate the privacy and natural setting, and I appreciate having found a way to profit from my property without having to deal with entitled neighbors or HOA politics. Margaret and I have developed a cordial relationship since our grocery store conversation. She's never again mentioned anything about community trail access, and I've never rubbed her nose in the financial success of my property management decisions. We nod politely when we see each other, like neighbors who've learned to respect each other's boundaries. The HOA has developed a new trail system using genuine public land about 2 miles from our neighborhood. It's longer and more scenic than the old trail, though it requires driving to reach the trailhead rather than walking from home. Several neighbors have told me it's actually a better hiking experience, even though it's less convenient. Last month, I received a letter from a real estate developer asking if I'd be interested in selling the Hillside property for residential development. The offer was for $350,000, which would represent an enormous profit over what my grandmother paid for the land in 1974. I haven't decided whether to sell or not. The money would be life-changing, but there's something satisfying about owning the land that caused so much drama. Plus, the rental cabin income is steady and growing, and I like the idea of building long-term wealth rather than just taking a one-time windfall. Sometimes I sit on my back porch in the evening, looking up at the hillside that inadvertently became the center of the biggest conflict of my adult life. The forest is recovering nicely from the selective logging. The smaller trees have grown to fill most of the gaps, and the overall ecosystem seems healthier and more diverse than it was when the mature pines dominated everything. The wrought iron gate still stands at the old trail entrance, though it's now partially hidden by the landscaping I had installed. Occasionally, I see neighbors walking by and glancing up at the hillside, probably remembering the trail that used to be there. I don't feel guilty about what happened. Property rights matter, and community relationships have to be based on mutual respect rather than entitlement. My grandmother was generous in sharing her land with neighbors, but that generosity should have been acknowledged and appreciated, not taken for granted. The timber money sitting in my investment account, earning compound interest, is a constant reminder that standing up for yourself can have unexpected benefits. Margaret's threats and aggressive attitude turned what should have been a simple tree removal project into a $30,000 windfall and a valuable lesson about the importance of knowing your rights. If I could go back and handle the situation differently, I'm not sure I would change anything. The conflict was unpleasant while it was happening, but the outcome exceeded my wildest expectations. I went from being harassed about cutting trees on my own property to owning a profitable rental business and having enough money invested to substantially improve my retirement prospects. The HOA learned that community amenities built on private property are fragile and dependent on the goodwill of property owners. The neighbors learned that 15 years of use doesn't create legal rights to someone else's land. And I learned that sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is refuse to be pushed around, even when it would be easier to give in. The empty lot next to my house went up for sale last month, and I'm considering buying it with some of the timber money. It would give me even more privacy and development options, plus prevent any future neighbors from trying to claim usage rights to my property. Real estate has turned out to be a much better investment than I ever imagined, largely thanks to Margaret's unwitting role in teaching me the value of my property rights. Her attempt to intimidate me into giving up my timber rights ended up making me financially independent. These days, when I'm cutting firewood or doing other property maintenance, I sometimes hear the sound of chainsaws echoing across the neighborhood and wonder if there's another property owner somewhere dealing with an overzealous peen. HOA. If so, I hope they're better prepared than I was to document their rights and stand their ground. The private property signs I installed after the logging operation have never been challenged or removed. The message is clear: this land is owned, managed, and enjoyed by someone who understands its value and won't be bullied into giving up their rights. Looking back, I realized that the whole conflict could have been avoided if Margaret had simply knocked on my door and asked about my tree removal plans instead of marching into my backyard with threats and demands. A friendly conversation about community concerns might have led to a collaborative approach that preserved both my property rights and neighborhood trail access. Instead, her aggressive attitude turned a neighbor into an opponent and a simple property maintenance issue into a costly lesson about the importance of respecting other people's rights. The irony is that the HOA ended up spending far more money trying to fight my property rights than they would have spent working with me to find a mutually beneficial solution. But that's the thing about entitled behavior. It usually costs more than cooperation, both financially and socially. Margaret learned that lesson the hard way, and the entire neighborhood is still living with the consequences of her initial approach to our conflict. As for me, I'm living with the consequences too. But mine happen to include a healthy investment portfolio, a profitable rental property, and the satisfaction of knowing that I stood up for my rights when it mattered most. Sometimes the best response to a bully is to show them exactly how much their behavior costs.